Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Chabot. I've got a new project to show you. Come on in. On today's episode, we recently acquired 4 beautiful pieces of stained glass. They have frames around them currently, but those frames need a little bit of TLC. Today, I'm going to take those all apart. We're going to rehab the frames, make a few additions to them, repaint them, and put them all back together. And then we're going to go inside and mount them in our house. But before we do that, you guys know what to do. Go grab your favorite beverage or even a snack too. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. Well, the director was on Facebook Marketplace again. You know what that means. Time for another project. She found these beautiful stained glass flowers. The frames were not in super great shape, and the glass has paint all over it, and they're just about to fall out of the frames. The director purchased 2 sets of these and asked me if I could clean them up. She also wants to make a few modifications. Here is my artist's rendition of the director's vision, and she guarantees me it is exactly what she wants. There won't be a single deviation from the plan. Anyways, to start things off, I'm going to disassemble these frames completely, first taking off these little pegs that are keeping the glass held into place, and then I'm going to be pulling the hinges off as well. And all of the removed parts go into the bag. I want to avoid the dreaded question of, did you happen to keep those scraggly hinges or half-broken bolts from that one picture frame project you did a few years ago? This way, I've got it covered. I'll just have to remember where I put the bag. Put the glass out, I can now focus on the frame and getting it completely disassembled as well. These screws were in terrible shape, and they had been painted over multiple times. A few of them tried to get stuck in there, but if you got enough lead in your pants, you can get them out. And parts go into the bag. And here's a small wooden pole I need to remove as well. And parts go into the bag. I'm not really sure what this was screwed into there, but what I can tell you is parts go into the bag. Now for the last 2 hinges to come off. And parts go into the bag. See, video proof that I kept all the parts together. Next up, I need to find the best orientation for the frames to fit together. I'm not sure if you guys could tell by the plan or not, but the hinges are getting deleted, and this frame that used to have hinges between the 2 is going to become one solid frame. Oops, nobody was supposed to see that. Now it's time to delete a couple layers of paint. Whoever has owned these in the past and repainted them did a really terrible job. They didn't remove any of the hardware, just kind of painted over everything and didn't give the stained glass the kind of frame that they deserve. We're going to fix that and give those flowers a new pretty home. This project required a lot of sanding. I know it's not the most enjoyable thing in the world to watch, but hey, it's a necessary evil when you're doing woodworking. Doesn't look so pretty, but everything is sanded down nice and flat. And now it's time to switch to the other frame and do the same thing. A quick switch of the sanding disc makes sanding go a whole lot better. Sanding complete, I can now focus on attaching these 2 frames together. I first figure out which 2 sides come together the best, and then I get out the Gorilla wood glue. I'm going to apply this first between the 2 frames, and after that I'm going to shoot a few nails in to hold everything together. After I put some glue on, I get out one of my handy dandy little brushes so that I can smear that glue all over the edge of the frame. With a nice coating of glue on there, I can now get out my clamps to hold these together. I want to make sure everything is nice and flat before shooting some nails in. I'm going to be shooting some 16 gauge, 1.5 inch long nails into both sides of the frame. See, you almost can't even tell that I glued and nailed these frames together. Now that they're nailed together, I can take all of the clamps off. And here's a first look at the front of the frame, but we still have a lot more work to go. Of course, the first thing up is some more sanding to get both of the frames as level as possible to each other. Next up, we'll be filling that crack down the entire center with some wood filler. That'll give this frame the appearance of being one solid frame, and not being able to see that seam in the center once we're done. This wood filler is essentially just a mix of sawdust and wood glue, and it does a really nice job filling any kind of gaps, holes, or even mistakes that might happen in your woodworking. And here's what it looks like once all of that wood filler is smeared in there. And yes, you probably guessed it, after the wood filler dries, it's time to sand everything nice and flush to each other. On the back side of the frames, I'm going to fill this gap with just some more wood glue. Off just a little bit of that extra glue to make sanding a little bit quicker. While all of that dries, it's time to work on the pickets for this frame. There's going to be 4 picket points that go across the top, so let's go ahead and get those cut out. After a few adjustments to my table saw to the exact width that the director requests these pickets to be made at, I get cutting. After that, another adjustment to the table saw so we can flip these pickets up on their side and cut down the width. This is probably one of my least favorite style of cuts on the table saw, and in just a moment, you'll see why. When you're making this kind of cut on a table saw, your material wants to lift and try to slap you in the face. You can see mine attempts it right here. See that little lift that occurred? If I wasn't holding on tight, that board would have whapped me right in the forehead. If I had any more than 2 pieces of wood to cut out, I would have set up one of my jigs that would help me keep that wood down. Anyways, we now have a piece of wood that we can start cutting our pickets with. Just in case I run into any issues with that, I'm cutting out a second one for backup. That way if I screw one up, I won't have to go back and do all these cuts on the table saw. I'll have another piece ready to go. That, these cuts are done, and we can switch over to the miter saw to turn these into pickets. I'm setting up a stop block that I can use to make all of these pickets identical. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my uncut picket piece to the back side of the 2x4. I'm going to make a cut, then I'll make one edge of my picket, then I have a line I drew on my 2x4 there to align that cut picket side to, make the other cut, and just like that, a perfect picket end. Flip this picket over to the opposite end, make the exact same cuts, and then I'm going to square my miter saw back up and cut both of those pickets to the exact length that I want them. And now I'm going to repeat the process 2 more times. Now I have 4 identical picket tips. Don't worry, I'll measure and figure out where those exactly go later. For now, we need to attach them. To do that, we're going to use my handy dandy pocket hole jig. I'll also be using some 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws. The screws are designed specifically for pocket holes so that when you screw them into your work, it doesn't crack your wood. Now let's drill some holes in these picket tips. I love pocket holes, and I find myself using them in many projects. For that reason, I have a drill that I always keep set up just for drilling pocket holes. It makes it a whole lot easier when I want to drill some that I don't have to set anything up. I just get out my jig and start drilling. And here's what those holes look like inside the picket tips. And here's our fully manufactured, ready to be attached picket tips. I'm going to first sand off a little bit of a burr where the drill bit popped out on these picket tips, just to make sure that they connect to the frame as flush as possible. And now we're ready to attach. A little bit of Gorilla Glue, smear that on there. Align it to the edge of the frame and shoot some of those pocket screws in. Excellent. Now rinse and repeat that 3 more times for this frame. And there we go. Our picket tips are attached to the frame. Of course, it's time to do some sanding again to make sure those picket tips are flush with the frame. A quick little sweep to get all the dust out of the nooks and the cranny. And now I'm going to put in a little bit more of the wood filler. Once that dried, a quick little zip zap with the sander to get everything ready for paint. I'm going to be painting this with a Sherwin-Williams satin white paint. We used this recently to paint our bathroom. It turned out really well and the paint goes on pretty good, so we decided to use it for these frames as well. Once the side is all painted up, I'm going to slip a couple pieces of wood underneath it and leave it alone to dry for a while. Once it was finished drying, I started applying the second coat of paint. After that finished drying, it's time to flip this over and paint the backside. Of course, can't do anything on this project without sanding it first. little bit more wood filler to fill in the crack along the middle. A little bit more to fill in the gaps between the picket tips and the frame. And it's time to sand again. Here's what that process looks like without all the fancy video editing. There was a lot of dust accumulation on the back side of the frame, so I got out my air compressor and blew all of that right out of there. Boards to get the frame back up off the blue tarp, and I'm ready to paint. I'm going to start painting the backside by doing all of the interior areas where the glass actually beats the frame. Although most of this area won't ever be seen, I still want it to look as good as possible. A question you might be asking yourself right now is, why didn't I fill in those pocket holes on the picket tips? Well, that's a really good question. It's also one that I had. I brought it up to the director. I even offered a couple of different solutions, which were promptly shot down.
Talking is never the answer, by the way.
So long story short, the decision was made to just paint them as they are. Anyways, it's another day, and it's time for another coat of paint. Pappy always said you can hide a lot of mistakes if you put enough paint on it. No, he didn't actually say that, but that's my leading theory in this project. With that being said, it's another day, and that means it's time to put a little more paint on it. Listen, I'm just trying to get my gold star from the director, okay? A few extra coats of unnecessary paint ain't gonna kill nobody. I'll just hear about it later once the director watches this video and reminds me how much paint I wasted. Ah, well, can't win them all. What I can tell you though is this is the final coat of paint, and once the paint dries, we're gonna finally start working on installing that glass. Here we go. Time to bring the glass in. I attempt the first test fitting here, and I notice it's fitting a little bit snug. Surely it had nothing to do with all that extra paint put on. Well, instead of debating that, let's just go ahead and fix it. I get out my wood chisel, and it makes really quick work of those corners. And now time for another test fit to see how we did. And it fits like a glove. Very nice, I'm really happy with that. I couldn't resist taking a quick peek at what the final project is going to look like. Oh yeah, I think the director is going to be pretty happy with that. Well, before I can mount this glass back into the frame, I need to clean a whole bunch of paint off these frames of the glass. I'm going to use one of my brass wire brushes and some elbow grease to make that happen. And finally, we get to mount the first piece of glass to the frame. The first step is pressing it in carefully but firmly, and the second step is attaching the mounting brackets. These particular ones are a 1/8 inch offset canvas clip that we ordered off Amazon, which ended up working pretty good. The problem ended up being that some of these pieces of glass were flush with the frame, and other parts of it had a bit of an offset. For the areas that were flush, I needed to make a little modification to the bracket. I slip the bracket into my vise, give it a nice squeeze, and it turns a 1/8 inch offset bracket into a completely flat bracket, which looks something kind of like this. That'll work. Let's go ahead and make a few more. Alright, with those clips flattened out now, we can start attaching them to the frame. I first align the clip to exactly where I want it, put a small dot with my pencil. Then I'm going to grab my drill that has a really small drill bit in it, and I'm going to drill through about half of the frame here. I need to be really careful not to pop out the other side. All of these clips came with their own screws, which fortunately were short enough not to pop out the other side of the frame as well. I tightened them down pretty tight, but not too tight, just a really good snug fit. And now I repeat the process all around the glass. With that first piece completely installed, I can now focus on the second piece of glass. Up first is once again cleaning off all of that excess paint on the frame. And with all of that cleaned off, it's now the second piece of glass's turn to get installed. I'm going to be using the exact same process of marking each clip, drilling it, and then putting a screw in. If you're wondering about my strange placement of these clips, it's because these pieces of glass had some slightly bent frames on them. On the areas that it would bend, I was trying to put a clip to hold it down to the frame as best as possible. I promise there was a method to my madness. Alright, just a couple more screws here, and we're going to have our very first frame finished. Now, I finally get to show the director the big reveal. You guys will have to wait until the end of this video. Well, let's just say she was pretty happy with it. That only means it's time to start on the next one. Once again, I'm going to start by removing these old plastic clips. And parts go into the bag. Up next, both pieces of glass get removed and then taken to get washed. Once again, we begin the disassembly process, taking off all of the hinges and hardware. And with all that done, we can begin my favorite part of this process, more sanding. Even though the prior frame turned out just fine, I decided on this one to strip off every drop of paint on it. Well, at least all of the paint my sander could reach. You see me replacing the sanding discs pretty often, and here's why. They quickly get clogged up with all that paint in them. I could probably attempt to clean it off using one of those rubber cleaners, but you know what? These pads are so cheap from Harbor Freight, I just put a new one on there. And here's the frame completely sanded down. Now I'm going to switch to the other half of this frame and do some more sanding. Just burning through those sanding discs. And just like that, both frames are completely sanded down and ready to be connected to each other. I need to first determine which of the sides fit the best together, and then it'll be time to put the glue on. Glue's on, now for the clamps. A few little tippity taps of my hammer to make sure both frames are flush to each other. A little more glue to fill in all the gaps. And it's time to let these dry. With everything dry, the clamps can come off, and I can shoot some nails into this frame to make sure they don't come apart. You can't tell yet, but right about here is where I make a mistake. Actually, two mistakes. I didn't quite get the angle of my nailer right, and I went and accidentally nailed the frames to my workbench. You can see the nails sticking through right here. Whoopsie. Well, that's okay. I've got a solution for that problem. It's my old friend, the angle grinder. After a quick few little zip zaps to get rid of those pieces of nail sticking through, I cut just a little bit deeper into the wood because I'm going to turn around and fill these in, and I want to make sure none of that nail is sticking through. And now I'm going to get out my wood filler, fill in all the cracks and holes, as well as my two little mistakes there. Just like that, my couple little mistakes are gone. Nothing a little wood filler and sanding can't fix. Oh yes, it's time to sand again. Now switching over to the back side of the frame, I can prep this for a little bit of wood filler too. After leaving it alone to dry for just a little bit, yep, you guessed it, sand it a little bit more. I promise we are just about done sanding for this project. The frame is looking really good, so let's go ahead and get all of the little dust bunnies out of here. Since I'm about to paint it, I want to make sure it's as clean as possible. A quick stir of the paint, and we can get painting. Like the prior frame, I'm going to go ahead and start on the inside where the glass meets the wood. And once that's completed, I can switch to a larger brush and paint the outside of the frame. The brushes that I'm using are just some cheap Harbor Freight paint brushes. You can get the brushes from 1 inch wide all the way up to 4 inches wide. Now, I ain't gonna lie, these are not the greatest brushes ever. They like to lose bristles often that you have to then pick out of your paint, and the bristles are pretty coarse, so you have to be really careful when you're painting something not to leave a whole bunch of lines behind. After letting that dry overnight, it's time to put another coat on the back of the frame. After finishing the second coat of paint on the back of the frame, it's time to flip over to the front side. Now, an astute observer of this episode of Shabok will notice that before I painted the prior frame, I had already attached the picket tips to it. As you'll note currently, this frame does not have any picket tips on it. Why is that, you may ask? Because I completely forgot. Yep, I got in such a hurry to start painting this frame, I forgot to complete it. Well, it was right about here that I noticed that, so that means it's time to build those picket tips. If you remember earlier, I ran 2 pieces of wood through my table saw, and that was because I had calculated I needed them both. So, fortunately, all I needed to do was set the jig back up on my miter saw and get to cutting those 4 picket tips. The nice part about doing this already before is it means I can eliminate a lot of the mistakes that I make along the way. The picket tips were no exception. Since I knew the last time I'd cut them a little bit too long, I made a little adjustment to make sure each one turned out just right without having to make any additional cuts. The template is in my left hand and the completed one in my right hand, and it looks like everything matches really good. Moving right along, I can drill the pocket holes on these picket tips. And now with those all drilled out, I can switch to attaching the picket tips to the frame. And with those attached, you guessed it, it's time for a little bit more sanding. First on the front side to get everything nice and flush. And then I'll flip it over and do the same thing on the back side. A little bit of wood filler to try and hide the seam between the 2 pieces of wood. And the same treatment goes on the backside. To knock down the wood filler, instead of using my orbital sander, I'm just going to use some of these sanding blocks. And And now because the picket tips aren't painted, as well as I had to rough up the frames just a little bit there to get everything nice and flush, I'm going to have to do a little bit more painting. Alright, now that I've got that first coat on there, I'm going to use those sanding blocks again to just quickly rough up the paint on the rest of the frame. Alright, now I'm going to put the first coat finally on the front of the picket tips, and also put a little bit of extra paint on the rest of the front of the frame. And finally, we're going to put the second coat of paint on the front of the frame, and that will be finally it for painting. With the frame completely dry from painting, I can focus on getting that old paint off of the stained glass. The wire brush and some elbow grease make some pretty quick work of that problem. Alright, these two frames are ready to be mounted. I'm going to first check and see how the fitment is on both pieces of glass to see if I need to make any modifications. What I noticed while doing this is that both pieces of glass have a bit of a gap between the glass and the frame on the inside. I need to shim both pieces of glass, otherwise from the front side you'll see a small gap at the top. Place some shims inside the gap here, and I mark each one of them at the exact height that matches the frame. I cut each one using my miter saw, and after that, I'm going to glue each of these into place. Although I'm sure the glue would be fine, this provided a wonderful opportunity for me to try out my new nail gun. Well, technically it's a pen nailer. I picked this gun up recently, and I've been itching to have a reason to use it. This fires nails that are about the width of a needle. The current length of the ones that I have in here are 1 inch long, just enough to keep this little piece of wood held into place without destroying any of the surrounding frame. After that, I slap a little bit of the white paint on each of these shims, just to make them a little bit more camouflaged. It is officially now time for final assembly. I'll first slip the pieces of glass back in the frame, checking to make sure nothing has changed since the last day I worked on them. With everything fitting well, it's time to put the clips on. I've already went ahead and bent the ones that we're going to be using here. On this frame, I'm going to mark and drill everything all at once. By pre-drilling all of those holes, it'll make sure that this wood doesn't split as I'm putting the screw in. And just like that, both of the frames are finally completed. Here is what they look like. The director felt they turned out good enough to promote them from being in the bathroom to being front and center in our kitchen. So, it's now time to install them. I first need to move the table and chairs out of the way, and then take down the existing window blinds. And you guessed it, parts go into the bag. The director has a plan to mount the frames right about here. She wants the stained glass frames hanging from the inside of the windowsill. To make that happen, I'm going to first drill some pilot holes into the top of each frame and install some eyelet screws. The director really wanted these eyelets to be brass in color, but this was the closest we could find in our area. After getting those eyelets installed, I can now measure and find out how far apart each of them are. Then, I can transfer that measurement up to the windowsill, where I can install another set of eyelets. And to connect everything together, the director has some bronze chain, along with some small hooks to connect the chain to the frames and to the hooks on the windowsill. And now it's finally time to hang the finished frame. And here's what the first one hanging up looks like. Now I just need to rinse and repeat that process one final time. And now I can hang the second frame. And so without further ado, I present to you the final result. We also installed an additional set of hooks so the frames could be moved to a different position. Well, that's gonna do it for this episode, folks. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed building it. Until next time, I'll see you guys soon.